The autumn leaves crunched under Zoe Taylor's new sneakers as she walked toward Westlake High School for her third day. The mid-October air felt crisp against her face, but the butterflies in her stomach weren't from the cool weather. Being the new kid was hard enough, but being one of the few black students at a school where diversity seemed like an afterthought made everything twice as challenging. Zoe adjusted her backpack straps and took a deep breath. "Just focus on your classes," she whispered to herself. "Just get through the day." Her first 2 days had gone by without much trouble. A few curious stares in the hallway, some polite but distant smiles, and teachers who seemed nice enough but struggled to pronounce her last name correctly. Nothing she hadn't dealt with before when her mom's job had moved them to 3 different schools in the past 4 years. Her morning classes went by quickly. She even answered a question in chemistry that nobody else knew, earning an approving nod from Mr. Ramirez. During lunch, she sat at the end of a table, quietly eating her sandwich while scrolling through texts from friends at her old school, who were already forgetting to check in regularly. When the final bell rang, Zoe felt a small sense of victory. Another day down. She gathered her books and headed toward the bus loop, mentally planning how she'd tackle her homework that evening. Her mom wouldn't be home until late again. The new job at the hospital kept her working long hours, so Zoe would have plenty of quiet time to get ahead on her assignments. The yellow school buses lined up outside, engines rumbling as students piled in. Zoe checked the small piece of paper where she'd written her bus number, Bus 17. She spotted it near the end of the line and walked over, joining the small crowd of students waiting to board. As she climbed the steps, the bus driver, an older man with gray hair and tired eyes, barely glanced at her. Zoe scanned the seats looking for an empty spot. The bus was about half full with plenty of options. She started walking toward a seat in the middle section when a loud voice cut through the general chatter. "Hey, new girl!" Zoe turned to see who was calling out. A girl with sleek blonde hair pulled into a high ponytail was staring directly at her. The girl sat near the front, surrounded by 3 friends who all wore similar outfits. Jeans, crop, tops, and expressions that made Zoe's stomach tighten. The blonde girl wore a silver necklace with a name pendant. Amber. Zoe hesitated, wondering if she should just ignore the call and find a seat. But something in the girl's tone made her pause. "Yes?" Zoe replied, keeping her voice steady. The bus had gotten quieter. Other conversations trailed off as students noticed the interaction. Amber's lips curled into what might have been mistaken for a smile, if not for the coldness in her eyes. "Those seats aren't for you," Amber said, loud enough for everyone to hear. She pointed toward the back of the bus. "You should go where you belong, back there." The words hung in the air. A few gasps broke the silence. Someone whispered, "Not cool," from somewhere behind Zoe, but not loud enough to count as real support. Zoe felt her face grow hot. She knew exactly what Amber was implying. The historical weight of those words, telling a black person to go to the back of the bus, wasn't lost on anyone present. This wasn't just ordinary bullying. This was something uglier. For a moment, Zoe thought about confronting Amber. She thought about the stories her grandmother had told her about standing up to racism in the 1960s. She thought about the speeches they'd studied last year about courage and dignity in the face of hatred. But she also thought about being new, about being alone in a school where she knew no one, about just wanting to get through the day without becoming that girl who caused a scene, about how tired she was of always having to be the one to educate others on why their words were hurtful. The bus remained silent. The driver stared straight ahead, either pretending not to hear or genuinely oblivious. Amber's friends exchanged glances, a mixture of discomfort and cruel amusement on their faces. "Did you hear me?" Amber pressed, her voice sharper. Zoe clutched her backpack strap tighter. She looked around, hoping someone, anyone, would speak up. A boy with dark hair and glasses looked like he might say something, but then dropped his gaze to his phone. A teacher passing by the window walked on, unaware of what was happening inside the bus. In that moment, Zoe made a choice. Not because she believed she belonged at the back, but because sometimes survival meant picking your battles. With as much dignity as she could muster, she walked past the empty seats in the middle section and moved to the back of the bus. As she sat down, she heard snickering from Amber's group. The regular chatter slowly resumed, though now punctuated with whispers and glances back at her. Zoe took out her earbuds, put them in, and stared out the window, not actually playing any music. She didn't want anyone to see how her hands were shaking or notice the tears that threatened to spill. The bus pulled away from the school, and Zoe watched Westlake High disappear from view. She thought of calling her mom, but knew she'd be in the middle of her shift and couldn't talk. Besides, what would she say? That on just her third day she'd already experienced the kind of racism her mother had warned her about, that she'd failed to stand up for herself? As houses and trees passed by outside the window, Zoe made a promise to herself. This wouldn't be the end of it. She wouldn't let Amber's cruelty define her time at this school. Somehow, some way, she would find her voice. She just needed to figure out how. When the bus stopped at her neighborhood, Zoe gathered her things and walked down the aisle. She kept her eyes forward, not giving Amber the satisfaction of seeing her affected. As she stepped off the bus, she heard someone say, "See you tomorrow, backseater." More laughter followed. The doors closed behind her with a hydraulic hiss, and the bus pulled away. Zoe stood on the sidewalk, her neighborhood suddenly feeling foreign despite having moved in 2 weeks ago. She walked home slowly, her mind racing with thoughts about tomorrow. Would it be the same? Would it get worse? Should she tell someone? As she turned onto her street, a text message buzzed on her phone. It wasn't from any of her old friends, it was from a number she didn't recognize. "Hey, this is Lee from your English class. What happened on the bus wasn't right. A bunch of us were talking about it. Want to meet up before school tomorrow? We've dealt with Amber before." Zoe stopped walking and read the message 3 times. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she thought. With slightly lighter steps, she continued toward home, already thinking about what tomorrow might bring. Zoe barely slept that night. She kept replaying the bus incident in her mind, thinking of all the things she should have said or done. By morning, dark circles had formed under her eyes, and her mom noticed immediately at breakfast. "You okay, sweetie? You look tired," her mom said, pouring coffee into her travel mug. She was already dressed in her hospital scrubs, ready for another long shift. "Just homework," Zoe lied, pushing her cereal around the bowl. She couldn't bring herself to tell her mom what had happened. Not yet. Her mom had enough to worry about. With the new job and bills? You sure? Her mom's eyes were concerned, seeing through the excuse. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just adjusting." Zoe managed to smile. "Good luck with your shift today." After her mom left, Zoe stared at the text from Lee again. She had responded last night agreeing to meet at the picnic tables near the school entrance at 7:30, 30 minutes before the first bell. Part of her wanted to just stay home, fake being sick, but a stronger part refused to give Amber that power. The walk to school felt longer than usual. Zoe kept her head down, wondering if she'd even recognize Lee. They'd barely spoken in English class, just a quick exchange about the homework assignment. Would anyone else really be there? Or was this some elaborate prank to make her day even worse? As she approached the school grounds, her steps slowed. The picnic tables came into view. One had a single occupant, an Asian boy with glasses and a blue jacket. He was scrolling on his phone but looked up as if sensing her approach. Next, to him sat a girl with curly red hair pulled back in a messy bun. They both straightened when they spotted her. "Zoe?" the boy called, standing up and waving awkwardly. Zoe approached cautiously. "Lee?" He nodded, offering a small smile. "Yeah, that's me. And this is Tessa." He gestured to the redhead. "Hey," Tessa said, her expression serious. "We saw what happened on the bus yesterday." Zoe's defenses immediately went up. "If you're here to tell me I should have stood up to her—" No, Lee interrupted, shaking his head vigorously. "That's not it at all. We wanted to say we're sorry." "Sorry?" Zoe repeated. "For not saying anything," Tessa explained, genuine regret in her voice. It happened so fast, and then it was over, and we just froze. Everyone froze, Lee added. But that doesn't make it right. Zoe sat down across from them, setting her backpack on the table. So what now? You want to be my bodyguards or something? The question came out more bitter than she'd intended. Lee pushed his glasses up. Actually, we wanted to tell you about Amber. And about the school, Tessa added. For the next 15 minutes, they gave Zoe what they called the real orientation. Lee explained that Amber Collins was a third-generation student at Westlake. Her grandfather had been the school's most famous football star, with a trophy case dedicated to him in the main hall. Her father was on the school board. She thinks she owns the place, Tessa said, and in some ways she kind of does. Teachers look the other way. The principal plays golf with her dad. But she's not the whole school, Lee insisted. Most students are just intimidated by her, or they just don't care enough to get involved, Tessa added. They told Zoe about Ms. Jackson, the history teacher who also ran the school's small diversity council. She's like the only adult here who actually cares about making this place better, Lai explained. She's been trying to get the administration to address the climate issues for years. Climate issues? Zoe asked. That's what they call it when they don't want to say racism and bullying, Tessa replied, making air quotes. More students were arriving now, the school grounds slowly filling with morning activity. Lee checked his watch. Look, we have 15 minutes before first period. Do you want to meet Ms. Jackson? She's usually in her classroom early. Zoe hesitated. Part of her still wondered if this was some elaborate setup, but the genuine concern in their eyes made her nod. Okay. They led her through the main entrance and down a corridor decorated with school pennants and trophy cases. Sure enough, they passed one dedicated entirely to Collins' family athletic achievements, with photos of serious-looking men in football uniforms spanning decades. Ms. Jackson's classroom was at the end of the east wing. The door was open, and inside a woman with warm brown skin and silver-streaked dreadlocks was writing on the whiteboard. She turned when they knocked. Good morning, she said, her eyes moving curiously between the three students. This is a surprise. Lee and Tessa rarely grace me with their presence until third period. Ms. Jackson, this is Zoe, Lee said. She's new. She had an incident with Amber Collins yesterday, Tessa added carefully. Ms. Jackson's expression changed immediately. She set down her marker and pulled over her desk chair. Sit down, Zoe. Tell me what happened. For the first time since the bus, Zoe felt like she could breathe. She recounted the story, her voice occasionally catching. Ms. Jackson listened without interrupting, her face showing a mixture of anger and resolve. When Zoe finished, Ms. Jackson nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me. And I'm sorry this happened, on my watch. It wasn't your fault, Zoe said automatically. When things like this happen in my school, it is partly my responsibility, Ms. Jackson insisted. Especially when it's not the first time. She glanced at Lee and Tessa, who both nodded in confirmation. So what happens now? Zoe asked. I have to ride that bus home again today. Ms. Jackson thought for a moment. First, I'm going to document this officially. Second, I'm going to call a meeting with the Diversity Council this afternoon. And third, she looked at Lee and Tessa, I think these two volunteers will be riding your bus home today. We will? Lee asked, looking surprised. We will, Tessa confirmed, nudging him with her elbow. This isn't just about punishing Amber, Ms. Jackson explained, leaning forward. This is about changing a culture, and that takes more than just one teacher's efforts. She looked directly at Zoe. It takes brave students who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. The first bell rang, making them all jump slightly. You'd better get to class, Ms. Jackson said, standing up. But Zoe, my door is always open, and I mean that literally. I never lock it during school hours. As they left the classroom, Zoe felt something she hadn't expected: hope. The school still felt foreign and unwelcoming, but now she had names and faces of people who seemed to care. People who saw what had happened and didn't think it was okay. What class do you have first? Lee asked as they reached the main hallway. Math. With Mr. Phillips, Zoe replied. That's on my way, Tessa offered. I'll walk with you. As they parted ways with Lee, Zoe caught sight of a familiar blonde ponytail in the crowd. Amber was standing by her locker, surrounded by her usual group. She hadn't noticed Zoe yet. Don't worry about her right now, Tessa said, following Zoe's gaze. One step at a time. Zoe nodded and turned away. She'd face Amber and the bus ride, home later. For now, it was enough to know she wasn't facing it alone. The day crawled by with the slowness that only comes from dreading something. Each time the bell rang, Zoe checked the clock, counting down the hours until she'd have to face the bus ride home. Though she'd barely known Lee and Tessa for half a day, the thought of them riding with her provided some comfort. During lunch, they sat together at a corner table. A few curious glances came their way. Apparently, seeing Lee and Tessa with the new girl was unusual enough to notice. Zoe picked at her sandwich, her appetite diminished by anxiety. You've been quiet all morning, Tessa observed, opening her yogurt. Thinking about the bus? Zoe nodded. What's the plan exactly? You two just sit with me? What if she says something? Anyway? Lee took a drink of his water. We talked about it in second period. We'll get on before you and save seats near the front. That way, you won't have to walk past Amber to find a place to sit. But that doesn't solve the actual problem, Zoe said, lowering her voice. She'll just find another way, another day. And you guys can't babysit me forever. Tessa and Lee exchanged looks. That's why we're meeting with Ms. Jackson after school, Tessa reminded her. Before the buses leave. The afternoon classes were a blur. Zoe's mind kept drifting from mathematics equations and history dates to what she would say at the meeting. By the time the final bell rang, her stomach felt tied in knots. She gathered her books slowly, stalling for time. Ms. Jackson's classroom was already occupied when they arrived. 4 other students sat in a semicircle of desks with Ms. Jackson perched on the edge of her own desk, mid-sentence. She paused when Zoe, Lee, and Tessa appeared in the doorway. Come in, come in. She waved them over. We were just getting started. Everyone, this is Zoe Taylor. Zoe gave an awkward half-wave as she took a seat. The other students, 2 boys and 2 girls, smiled in greeting. They introduced themselves as Raj, Diego, Hannah, and Kim. All were juniors or seniors, and all were part of what Ms. Jackson called the council. I've filled them in on what happened yesterday, Ms. Jackson explained. And we've agreed that this isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern we need to address. Amber's been worse this year, Hannah said, twisting a braided bracelet around her wrist. Ever since her dad became head of the school board. She thinks she's untouchable, Diego added, his expression serious. And honestly, sometimes it seems like she is. No one is untouchable, Ms. Jackson stated firmly. But we need to be strategic about how we approach this. Zoe, what would you like to see happen? All eyes turned to Zoe. She hadn't expected the question. She'd assumed they'd tell her what the plan was, not ask for her input. I don't know, she stammered. I just don't want to be harassed on the bus. I don't want anyone to be harassed. Of course, Ms. Jackson nodded. That's the immediate goal. But I'm asking what you want beyond that. Do you want Amber punished? Do you want a formal apology? Do you want broader changes at the school? Zoe thought about it. I don't think punishment alone would change anything. She'd just be angrier. She hesitated, then continued. What I really want is for people to understand why what she did was so hurtful. Not just because it was mean, but because of the history behind it. Ms. Jackson's eyes lit up. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need. She turned to the others. Many incidents at this school, not just with Amber, happen because students don't understand the context of their actions. So what are you suggesting? Raj asked. A history lesson? Something like that, Zoe said, an idea forming. What if we did a project about transportation and civil rights? Not just about buses, but about all the ways people have been excluded, from spaces based on who they are. Like the Seat of Honor display they did at Central High last year, Kim offered. They highlighted a different historical figure each week who stood up against segregation. Yes, but we could make it more interactive. Tessa jumped in, her enthusiasm building. Not just displays, but activities that help people understand what it feels like to be excluded. For the next 20 minutes, ideas bounced around the room. Diego suggested involving the drama club in creating short performances. Raj, who was on the school newspaper, offered to write a series of articles. Hannah, who knew the principal's secretary, promised to find a way to get the project officially approved. Ms. Jackson watched with a smile, occasionally steering the conversation but mostly letting the students take the lead. Zoe found herself getting caught up in the energy, her anxiety about the bus temporarily forgotten. "This is all wonderful," Ms. Jackson finally said, checking the clock. "But we need to address the immediate issue too. The buses leave in 15 minutes. Reality crashed back. Zoe's shoulders tensed. "We've got that covered," Lee assured her. "Tessa and I will ride with Zoe today. And tomorrow I'll handle personally," Ms. Jackson interrupted. "I've already spoken to Mr. Reynolds, the bus driver. He's been instructed to report any incidents directly to me." "You talked to the bus driver?" Zoe asked, surprised. "I did. And he felt terrible about yesterday. He said he didn't fully realize what was happening until it was too late." Ms. Jackson's expression was kind but firm. "People often don't act because they don't know how. That's what we're going to change." As they gathered their things to leave, Ms. Jackson pulled Zoe aside. "Are you okay with all of this? It's a lot to take on during your first week." Zoe nodded slowly. "I think so. It feels better to do something than to just let it happen." "That's how most change starts." Ms. Jackson squeezed her shoulder gently. "Not with big speeches or dramatic stands, but with regular people deciding they've had enough." They walked to the bus loop together, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. True to their word, Lee and Tessa boarded Zoe's bus first, securing seats near the front. Zoe followed, heart pounding as she stepped up. The bus driver, Mr. Reynolds, gave her a deliberate nod, a silent acknowledgement of yesterday's failure and today's vigilance. Zoe nodded back and moved toward Lee and Tessa. As she sat down, she felt eyes on her back. Turning slightly, she caught Amber staring from a few rows back, her usual friend surrounding her. But instead of the smug expression from yesterday, Amber looked wary, perhaps confused by the change in seating arrangement and the presence of Lee and Tessa. The bus pulled away from the curb. Conversation gradually filled the silence. Homework, complaints, weekend plans, the upcoming basketball game. Normal teenage chatter that had been absent yesterday during the tense standoff. "Phase 1 complete," Tessa whispered, bumping Zoe's shoulder lightly. "You okay?" Zoe nodded, realizing with mild surprise that she was. The knot in her stomach had loosened. "Yeah, I'm good. But this is just the beginning, right?" "Right," Lee agreed, glancing back briefly. "The real work starts tomorrow with the project." As houses and trees passed by the window, Zoe found herself thinking not about what had happened yesterday, but about what might happen tomorrow. For the first time since arriving at Westlake, she felt a spark of purpose. Something more than just surviving another day at a new school. The bus stopped at her neighborhood. As she stood to leave, she caught Mr. Reynolds watching her in his rearview mirror. He gave her another nod, this one containing what might have been an apology. Zoe nodded back and stepped off the bus, the doors closing behind her with a different sound than yesterday, less final, less isolating. As the bus pulled away, she realized she was actually looking forward to tomorrow. Word spread quickly at Westlake High. By the time Zoe arrived the next morning, whispers followed her through the hallway. Some students nodded in greeting who had never acknowledged her before. Others watched curiously from a distance. The simple act of not sitting at the back of the bus, of having Lee and Tessa beside her, had already created ripples. "They're calling it the bus thing," Lee informed her as they met at her locker. "Diego said he overheard Amber complaining to the vice principal this morning." "Complaining about what?" Zoe asked, swapping out books for her morning classes. "About being ganged up on, apparently," Tessa said, making air quotes with her fingers. Because 3 people sitting together is a gang now. Zoe's stomach tightened. Is she trying to get us in trouble? Actually, it backfired. Lee grinned. The vice principal called Ms. Jackson to verify what happened, and now they're fast-tracking approval for our project. The Seat of Honor project had evolved overnight. What started as a vague idea had transformed into a detailed plan, thanks to a flurry of texts between the Diversity Council members. Raj had already drafted an article for the school paper, and Kim had created a proposal, outline complete with a timeline and budget. We're meeting at lunch to divide up tasks, Tessa explained. The goal is to launch next Monday. The morning passed in a blur of classes and whispered conversations. Twice Zoe caught Amber staring at her from across a classroom. Each time Amber quickly looked away, her expression unreadable. Not angry exactly, but not apologetic either. Just watchful. When lunchtime arrived, Zoe headed toward their usual corner table, only to find it already occupied by the entire Diversity Council. Extra chairs had been pulled up and papers were spread across the surface. Ms. Jackson sat among them, her lunch forgotten as she reviewed something on Kim's laptop. Just in time, Diego called, waving Zoe over. We're finalizing the schedule. For the next 20 minutes, they divided responsibilities. Hannah and Kim would handle the physical displays in the main hallway. Raj would coordinate with the school, paper for weekly features. Diego would work with the drama club on a brief performance piece for the upcoming assembly. Lee and Tessa would create a section on the school's website dedicated to transportation history and civil rights. What about me? Zoe asked, realizing she hadn't been assigned a specific role. Ms. Jackson looked up from the laptop. We thought you might want to be the one to introduce the project at next week's assembly, to explain why it matters. Zoe hesitated. Public speaking wasn't her strong suit, especially not in front of a school where she still felt like an outsider. No, you don't have to decide right now, Ms. Jackson assured her. Think about it. The conversation shifted to logistics, supplies needed, permission forms for field trips to the local museum, coordination with teachers to incorporate elements into their classes. It was becoming much bigger than Zoe had imagined, growing beyond just a response to one incident on a bus. The cafeteria had started to empty when a shadow fell across their table. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Zoe turned to find Amber standing there, alone for once without her usual group of friends. The table went silent. Can I talk to you? Amber asked, her voice lower than usual. She was addressing Zoe directly. Everyone at the table tensed. Tessa half rose from her seat, but Ms. Jackson gently placed a hand on her arm. Alone, Amber added, glancing nervously at the others. Zoe looked at Ms. Jackson, who gave a subtle nod, then back at Amber. Okay, she said, standing up. But just for a minute, we're working on something. They moved to an empty table a few yards away, still within sight of the Diversity Council but out of earshot. Amber sat down, fidgeting with the silver nameplate on her necklace. Up close, Zoe noticed dark circles under her eyes, poorly concealed with makeup. So talk, Zoe prompted when Amber remained silent. Amber took a deep breath. I heard about your project, the civil rights thing. And? Zoe crossed her arms, wary of where this was going. And I think you're trying to get me in trouble. Amber's words lacked their usual bite. Make me look bad in front of everyone. Zoe stared at her in disbelief. You told me to sit at the back of the bus because I'm black. You made yourself look bad. Amber flinched at the direct accusation. I didn't mean it like that. How else could you possibly mean it? Zoe asked, her voice rising slightly despite her effort to stay calm. I don't know, Amber admitted, looking down at the table. I always say things to the new kids. It's what I do. That doesn't make it better, Zoe pointed out. That makes it worse. Amber was quiet for a moment. My dad's really mad. The principal called him last night. Zoe didn't reply. She wasn't going to feel sorry for Amber because she was facing consequences for her actions. He said I'm embarrassing the family, Amber continued. That people will think we're racists. Maybe don't do racist things then, Zoe suggested bluntly. To her surprise, Amber didn't get angry. Instead, she just looked tired. It's not that simple. It kind of is, though, Zoe insisted. But something in Amber's defeated expression made her soften slightly. Look, the project isn't about you. It's about education, about helping people understand why what you said was so hurtful. What if? Amber hesitated. What if I wanted to help? Of all the things Zoe had expected from this conversation, that wasn't one of them. Help? With the project? Amber nodded, still not meeting Zoe's eyes. I could get other people involved, people who might not listen to you or your friends. Zoe studied the girl across from her. Was this a trick? Some elaborate plan to sabotage the project from within? Or was Amber genuinely offering an olive branch? Either way, she wasn't sure she wanted Amber anywhere near something that mattered so much to her. Why would you want to help? Zoe asked carefully. Amber finally looked up. Because I'm not stupid. I know what I said was wrong. She trailed off. Just what? I'm scared, Amber admitted, the words barely audible. My family has been at this school forever. My grandfather's picture is in the trophy case. I'm supposed to be a certain way, do certain things, hang out with certain people. She twisted her necklace again. I don't know how to be anything else. Zoe hadn't expected this vulnerability. The powerful bully suddenly looked like what she actually was, a teenager struggling with expectations and identity, just like everyone else. I'm not saying we should be friends, Zoe clarified. What you did was still wrong. I know, Amber nodded, and I don't fully trust your reasons for wanting to help. That's fair, Amber acknowledged. Zoe glanced back at the Diversity Council table where everyone was pretending not to watch them. I need to discuss it with the others. It's not just my project. Okay, Amber agreed, standing up. Just let me know, I guess. She started to walk away, then turned back. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry. About the bus, I really am. Zoe watched her leave the cafeteria, trying to process what had just happened. When she returned to the Diversity Council table, they bombarded her with questions. What did she want? Did she threaten you? Is she trying to stop the project? Zoe sat down, still puzzled by the conversation. Actually, she wants to help with the project. The table erupted with disbelief and skepticism. Only Ms. Jackson remained quiet, watching Zoe thoughtfully. Do you believe her? She finally asked when the others had calmed down. Zoe considered the question carefully. I'm not sure, but I think she might actually mean it. People can surprise you, Ms. Jackson said, sometimes in good ways. So what do we do? Diego asked. Let her in? They all looked at Zoe, waiting for her decision. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period, but nobody moved. Let me think about it, Zoe said finally. This isn't something we should rush into. As they gathered their things to head to afternoon classes, Zoe spotted Amber in the hallway, standing alone by her locker. Their eyes met briefly across the crowd of students. This time, neither of them looked away. 3 weeks had passed since the bus thing, as everyone now called it. The hallways of Westlake High looked different than they had before. Large displays lined the main corridor, each highlighting different historical figures who had fought against segregation. Quotes about equality and inclusion decorated classroom doors. The school newspaper had run 3 special editions focused on civil rights and transportation history, and most surprisingly of all, Amber Collins had become an active participant in it all. Zoe still remembered the Diversity Council meeting where they debated whether to accept Amber's offer to help. The vote had been split until Zoe finally made the call. Let's give her a chance, but keep our eyes open. Now, as Zoe walked through the school's front entrance, she could see Amber across the lobby, hanging up posters for the final assembly, scheduled for that afternoon. Their relationship wasn't exactly friendship, too much had happened for that, but it had evolved into something like cautious respect. Morning, Lee called, falling into step beside Zoe. Ready for the big day? Zoe adjusted her backpack strap nervously. As ready as I'll ever be. After much deliberation, she had agreed to speak at the assembly, to tell her story and explain why the project mattered. The thought of standing in front of the entire student body still made her stomach twist, but she was determined to do it. You've practiced 100 times, Tessa reminded her, joining them from the opposite hallway. You've got this. They stopped at Zoe's locker, now decorated with photos from the various Seat of Honor events they'd organized over the past weeks. Field trips to the Civil Rights Museum. A community service day cleaning up a historic cemetery where Black community leaders were buried. A panel discussion with local elders who had experienced segregation firsthand. What had started as a response to one hurtful incident had blossomed into something much larger, something that had begun to change the culture of the school itself. Ms. Jackson wants to see us before first period, Lee said, checking his phone. Something about a surprise for the assembly. They found Ms. Jackson in her classroom, surrounded by boxes that had just been delivered. Raj, Diego, Hannah, and Kim were already there, peering into the largest box with expressions of awe. What's going on? Zoe asked. Ms. Jackson looked up, her face glowing with excitement. Remember how we applied for that community grant to expand the project? The one we didn't think we'd get because the deadline was so soon? Yeah, Tessa said, moving closer to the boxes. We got it. Ms. Jackson pulled out a blue t-shirt with "Take a seat, make a stand" printed on the front. The back featured a stylized image of a bus with diverse faces in the windows. And these arrived just in time for the assembly. There's enough for the whole school, Kim added, already sorting them by size. And that's not all, Ms. Jackson continued. The school board approved our proposal for a permanent exhibit in the main hall, right next to the sports trophies. The news took a moment to sink in. A permanent exhibit meant the project wouldn't end with the semester. It would become part of the school's identity, something future students would see every day. Wow, Zoe breathed, running her fingers over one of the shirts. I never thought it would get this big. That's what happens when people care enough to make noise, Ms. Jackson said, squeezing her shoulder. Speaking of which, we should distribute these before the assembly. Everyone grab a box. The morning passed in a blur of excitement. In every class, teachers allowed a few minutes for the Diversity Council members to hand out t-shirts and remind students about the afternoon assembly. Reactions ranged from enthusiasm to indifference, but no one seemed openly hostile, a marked change from the atmosphere just weeks earlier. During lunch, Zoe retreated to the library to review her speech one last time. She'd written and rewritten it dozens of times, trying to find the right balance between sharing her personal experience and addressing the broader issues. Now, as she read through the final version, she felt a strange calm settle over her. Shadow fell across her paper. Looking up, she was surprised to see Amber standing there, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. Hey, Amber said, clutching a folder to her chest. Can I talk to you for a second? Zoe gestured to the empty chair across from her. Sure. Amber sat down, placing the folder on the table between them. I wanted to show you something before the assembly. She opened it to reveal newspaper clippings, some yellowed with age. What are these? Zoe asked, leaning forward to look more closely. My grandfather, Amber explained, pointing to a faded photo of a young man in a football uniform. He was the school's star quarterback in 1964. Zoe nodded. She'd seen his picture in the trophy case many times over the past weeks. But that's not the whole story, Amber continued, flipping to another clipping. This one showed a group of white students standing in front of the school, holding signs with slurs and hostile messages. In the center of the group stood a young man who looked remarkably like Amber's grandfather. He was one of the students who protested when the school integrated, Amber said quietly. He was suspended for 2 weeks for throwing rocks at the first Black students who enrolled here. Zoe stared at the photo, then at Amber, unsure what to say. I never knew about this, Amber continued. It's not in the trophy case or the yearbooks. My dad never mentioned it. She took a deep breath. I found these yesterday in our attic while looking for photos for a different project. Why are you showing me this? Zoe asked carefully. Amber met her eyes directly. Because I'm mentioning it in my introduction before your speech today. People should know the whole history, not just the parts we're proud of. She hesitated. I wanted to make sure you were okay with it first. Zoe was speechless for a moment. You're really going to talk about this? In front of everyone? Your dad will be furious. Probably, Amber admitted with a grimace. But it feels like the right thing to do. Besides, she added with a hint of her old confidence, it's not like he can ground me forever. For the first time, Zoe smiled genuinely at Amber. That's actually really brave. I'm learning, Amber said, returning the smile tentatively. From you. The final bell rang at 2:30, signaling the start of the assembly. Students filed into the gymnasium, many already wearing their new t-shirts. The Diversity Council members bustled around, making last-minute adjustments to the presentation setup. Zoe stood backstage, trying to calm her racing heart. Through a gap in the curtains, she could see the bleachers filling with students and teachers. In the front row sat her mother, who had taken a rare afternoon off work to attend. Beside her was Mr. Reynolds, the bus driver, his hands folded nervously in his lap. 5 minutes, Ms. Jackson announced, clipboard in hand. Everyone ready? Amber appeared at Zoe's side, dressed in the same blue t-shirt as everyone else, her usual designer clothes nowhere to be seen. Ready? She asked. Ready, Zoe confirmed, surprised to realize she meant it. The principal's voice came over the microphone, welcoming everyone to the assembly. He spoke briefly about the importance of inclusion and respect, using words that sounded like they'd been borrowed directly from the Diversity Council's materials. Then it was Amber's turn. She walked onto the stage with purposeful steps, her ponytail swinging. The crowd murmured in surprise. No one had expected her to be part of the presentation. As Amber began to speak, revealing the truth about her family's complicated history with the school, Zoe watched the audience's reactions: shock, discomfort, and then, gradually, respect. When it was Zoe's turn to take the stage, she felt a strange sense of coming full circle. Just weeks ago, she had been the new girl, alone at the back of a bus. Now she stood before the entire school, her voice strong and clear as she shared her story. What happened that day on the bus wasn't just about me, she concluded, looking out over the sea of blue shirts. It was about all of us, about who we choose to be when faced with moments that test our character. Sometimes change starts with just one person taking a stand, or in this case, refusing to take a seat at the back. As applause filled the gymnasium, Zoe caught sight of her mother wiping away tears in the front row. Beside her, Mr. Reynolds was applauding so enthusiastically, his glasses had slipped down his nose. The Diversity Council joined Zoe on stage for the final announcement. The unveiling of the permanent exhibit would take place the following Monday. As cameras flashed to capture the moment for the school website, Zoe and Amber stood side by side at the center of the group. Not quite friends, but no longer enemies. A symbol, perhaps, of what was possible when people chose understanding over division.